We're on week 2 this morning of our Jesus series. If you missed last week, you would have missed seeing these beautiful banners that have gone up. Jesus left and right, which is absolutely amazing. It's all about him. And in the series, we're looking at Matthew 14 and Matthew chapter 15. Last week, we looked at Matthew 14, verse 1 to 12. Today, we're carrying on Matthew 14, verse 13 through to 21. And before I read those verses, could I invite you to pray together with me? Father, this morning as we come to your word, we're so grateful to you that we aren't left to guess what you like and what you're about. You have given us your word, the revelation that you've given us through these written pages to help us understand what you are like. Jesus Christ, we're so grateful that you came to this earth. As we read these stories and read the Gospels about you, I pray that you would speak to our heart and you would change our lives in Jesus' name. Amen. Matthew 14:31 says, when Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. So hearing what had happened, that was referencing John the Baptist's death that we mentioned last week. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed those who were ill. So this all happened around the Sea of Galilee. It's not a very big inland lake. And the crowds could have seen Jesus' boat. And so they track around the outside of the Sea of Galilee. And by the time he arrives looking for some alone time, there are crowds of people waiting for him. It says when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them. We're going to come back to that word just now. It says he healed those who were ill. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. How many of you would consider yourselves fairly practical people? Something needs organized, you're organizing it. How many of you practical people think that looks like a pretty good suggestion? Okay, it's reaching evening. The people don't have food. Let's close the meeting so that people can go and get their food. This is a good practical suggestion. Verse 16, Jesus replied, so this is to his disciples, the 12 of them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Again, back to those same practical people. How many of you does that sound like an impractical suggestion? You know, if you know months in advance that you're going to have 10,000 plus people coming for a meeting on the side of the Sea of Galilee, you could have organized the catering teams, the tables, the tents, the generators in case of load shedding, etc., etc. Organized what needs to be done. But this is spur of the moment. Jesus says, they don't need to go away. You guys, you give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Now, John's gospel tells us that there was a boy who arrived prepared with his lunch. So Jack's preached on this message preached using this similar text earlier this year. And she had 5 loaves and 2 whole fish that she had frozen. And if you were here that Sunday, you might remember it was a stinking hot Sunday, and those fish started to just defrost a little bit, and we could start to smell it in these front rows. So I've just got the loaves here today. So the disciples come to him and say, all we managed to find is a young boy who brought 5 loaves and 2 fish. That's all the food for the whole lot of us. Something incredible happens. Bring them here to me, he said. He told the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. So this wasn't just a little molecule of bread. Look, okay, we've got a lot to go around. Just thank you and be grateful. There was at least a crumb for you. They all ate. I understand that to mean they ate as much bread and as much fish as they wanted. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So this could have been a crowd anywhere between 10 and 15,000 people and that kind of thing. For some reason, they just counted the men and said the women and children weren't included in the head count that day. Isn't this an amazing story? Wow! If you've heard it before, you know about the feeding of the 5,000. Don't let that detract from the wowness of how amazing this is. I mean, that's the kind of story you could just read it over and over and just go, wow, at that verse. Wow, 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 wow. It's an astounding and important miracle. Interestingly, by my count, there are 35 individually recorded miracles that Jesus did in the Gospels. That excludes the group miracles where he healed the sick, as it mentioned in the first verse. But 35 individual miracles. Of those 35, this is the only miracle that all four Gospel writers record. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There's one miracle you'll find in all four of them. That's this one, the feeding of the 5,000. So 4 times you read, if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 times you read the story with slightly different details. Interestingly, on another occasion, Jesus multiplied fish and loaves to feed another whole bunch of people. On that story, it said there were 4,000 men, excluding women and children. And that story actually is also in our text for this series. I'm including it in today, though. So Matthew 14, feeding 5,000. Matthew 15, Jesus feeds 4,000, including 4,000 men, excluding women and children. That story is repeated twice. So 6 times in the Gospels, you've got record of these 2 stories of Jesus multiplying loaves and fish to feed thousands of people. This isn't a main point that I'm making today, but I think one of the reasons why it's recorded like it is because it was one of the clearest expressions of Jesus' divinity. You know, it's all well and good a man coming and claiming to be God. Lots of people who claim to be lots of different things. Many people with psychiatric difficulty claiming to be this guy or that guy. So one of the accusations towards Jesus is either he was a liar or a lunatic, or he meant exactly what he said. But it's easy enough to say that kind of thing. But there's not many con men, not many liars or lunatics who would dare take 5 loaves and 2 fish, turn to heaven, give thanks, and can feed 10 to 15,000 people with 1 picnic basket worth of samis. It shows that he is Lord over all created matter. The atoms and molecules multiplied incredibly in the hands of his disciples. There is so much in this story that part of my challenge in putting it together was, not to preach what Jackie had because it was so brilliant, but there is so much else in the story, so I've limited myself to picking 3 things. And I'd like to first of all draw your attention in the story to Christ's compassion. This is the attribute of Jesus that is most often actually spoken about by the gospel writers. Christ had compassion on people. We read in verse 14, it said, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he said, my rest time has been disturbed, go away. No, it said he had compassion on them and healed those who were ill. Now, there's different places you could put yourself in the story if you're trying to imagine what it must have been like. One of the places is to be in the crowd. You just heard, there's this guy. He's doing incredible miracles. The stuff he says, no one else says. The things he does, no one else does. So you just pitch up, you head off from your fields or from your work, and you're just with the crowd of these thousands of people wandering out into the hills of Galilee to listen to the teacher teach. Wouldn't you be grateful that he had compassion? Especially if you took someone who was sick and a family member and you traipsed around the side of the Sea of Galilee the whole day to find where Jesus had landed. He says to them, they don't need to go away. He says to his disciples, he's having compassion on the hungry people. Hungry, tired, and some of them sick. Sounds like us on occasion. the beautiful thing in the Gospels is that whenever you see that Jesus had compassion, generally there was a miracle close behind. In Matthew 15, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. He went on to feed the 4,000 plus. Matthew 20, verse 34, there were two blind men who called out from the side of the road saying, have mercy on us. And it says Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. Immediately they received their sight and followed him. This was such an amazing attribute of Jesus when he was walking on this earth, and that he still has. Thank God that he has compassion for us. One of the illustrations Jesus used to describe human beings was sheep. And sheep are not very bright. When I was a youngster, we used to go out to the farm and stay there for some weeks at a time. And one day, our job was to help herd the flock of sheep, and they were all getting dosed and then dipped. That was a tough job, because those sheep didn't know that what was good for them. What they most needed was the thing they least wanted. And then one sheep got away, and then all the sheep joined. And then a whole day's work to get the good stuff into those sheep. And Jesus says, you are like sheep. That's not a compliment. Thank God that he's the good shepherd. And that he doesn't say, okay, you little sheep, you didn't want to take what's good for you. You're out of the flock. You've had two bad, bang, gone. Ja. How many of us sheep would be left if he didn't have compassion? Not one of us. And he sees the crowd. He sees us with our complicated, awkward, messed up sometimes lives. And the only one in the universe who's got the right to say, hey, listen, you should have listened. You should have done better. The only one who's got the right to say that doesn't. And this is the great news in the story, is that Jesus has got compassion for us. When we're hungry and when we're tired, when we're sick, when we've made bad decisions, and some of us can look back on detours that we've taken that just, like it's all on you and all on me. God had nothing to do with that stuff, and we come back, God, I'm so sorry. He has compassion. And he doesn't just have compassion for us, he wants to have compassion through us. So the good news for me is that Jesus has got compassion for me. I'm part of the crowd. I'm a lost sheep that he's found, and he's trying his best. Well, I'm saying he's trying his best. I'm trying my best to follow him, but I'm like this sheep. And he has compassion on this sheep that just so often does his own thing. But he doesn't just have compassion to us or for us, he wants compassion through us. So when you read the Gospels, you always need to have multiple lenses on, because Jesus did it for those people then, but he's also doing it for these people now, me and us. Jesus was in the flesh then, walking, teaching. But something far more profound happens now. Ephesians tells us that Christ dwells in our hearts by faith. So he's not just outside. He's not just the God of the universe. The God of compassion, when I accept him by faith, lives inside of me as well as outside and controlling the universe. So he has compassion to me, but the Jesus in me wants to have compassion through me. There's a whole lot more that can be accomplished with compassion than with criticism. Christ wants to express his compassion through us into the lives of others. So being the recipient of compassion, I should be a giver of compassion. Compassion isn't given because it's deserved. Compassion isn't reserved for those who have everything right. They don't need compassion. They need admiration. Compassion is reserved for those who don't deserve it, for those who are doing things differently to how you think should be done. Doing things differently to how Jesus taught they should be done. It's far easier to lean into cynicism. It's far easier to lean into kind of, well, they should know better. Of course. But imagine if Jesus said that to me every time. Well, he should know better. Now, I'm not doing away with consequence, and we teach about that regularly. But this is such a profound part of the story, is Jesus had compassion. The crowds should have brought food. They should have known, you're going to go with Jesus, going to be a long, long, long healing service and teaching. Yeah, they should have known better. Of course they should have. And in spite of all of that, he has compassion. And the same Christ wants to have compassion through me to the lives of others. This doesn't come naturally. It's easy to have compassion for those closest to us, but it's a deep supernatural work God wants to do in our hearts, is to have compassion for those further from us. Compassion means, as far as I understand, to suffer with. To have in my heart, wow, I can't believe that person's in that situation, but I'm with them there, even though I can't physically do it. I remember when our youngest son, when he got about yay high, had tremendous problems with his ears. And went along to the doctor, and they said, this sometimes happens with kids. Took some meds, and eventually said, look, Ethan's going to need surgery. We need to put grommets in. It's not a very big deal. For those who don't know what grommets is, they make an incision in the eardrum and insert just a little tiny plastic goodies to help the outside the eardrum and inside the eardrum equalize, on this side and that side. And it's a simple procedure, but it's done under general anesthetic. So here we go along with this little tot into the hospital. And he doesn't know what's coming, but he's terrified. Understandably, there's all these people, and then they take him into the theater. And where we were allowed to be in our gowns, and they allowed one of us to go into the theater with them. So Jackie very kindly offered that I should go along with Ethan. And here's this little Okie, and he's usually very calm. But that day, I don't know what happened, but the pre-med, there's all these people with masks and gowns. I probably would have freaked out a bit as well if I was that age. And the anesthetist is trying to just grab his head and shove the mask on. I said, could you just give me 10 seconds? I just whisper in his ear, but I'm like, boy, it's going to be okay. Just take a deep breath. Just lie down. As he breathes, now the mask can go on. So now he's okay, he's out, but we're not okay. We've got compassion. We're out there. We hope it, I'm pretty sure it's going to be fine, but stuff occasionally goes wrong in surgeries. And so the compassion that you feel as a parent is something like this. If there was any way I could be there, I know how to breathe deeply. Wouldn't have freaked me out. But I can't, and so all I can have is compassion. I'm together with him. We went through that 3 more times with him. He ended up having grommets an unheard of 4 times in his ears. Each time, mom and dad out there, mom giving dad the privilege of going into theater. Thank you. But it's the waiting outside when somebody is having something happen to them, that the feeling that's compassion. It's impossible for me to feel equally for every other person in the world. And so often what we do is we try and feel nothing at all, because it sometimes feels too much to feel so much. And yet the Christ in me wants to produce compassion, that I live a gracious and compassionate life because of him in me. This is a massive challenge. I read these verses, I'm exceptionally challenged because I don't always err towards compassion. And yet the compassionate Christ, when he saw the crowds, always said, have compassion on them. The second thing I'd like you to notice from the story is Christ's provision. Christ's provision. I said there were a couple of different places you could be in the story. One of them is, as the crowd, try the next place, wear the next set of sandals, be one of the disciples. So Jesus calls you, you're following him. This is fantastic. Got to leave everything behind. But man, wow, he has the answers. And then this moment happens. And you come to him and you say, look, just on the logistics side, we've been doing our maths. And the time and food and crowds, it doesn't all equal up. We should send them away to get other food. And you might expect somebody as compassionate as Jesus to say, well, thank you, Steve. Well done. That was great maths. That, guys, look, it's got late. You go and get some chow. All the best. That was Steve's idea. He's a practical guy. Let's give him a round of applause. Well done for thinking all that stuff through. But nothing of the sort happens. Jesus answers the problem with a problem. I don't know if you noticed that. Is it okay? We did all the maths, the crowds, the food, and the time left is not enough. So we have a problem, Jesus. And Jesus answers the problem with a problem. He says, no, they don't need to go away. Everyone, you just stay right here. You give them something to eat. Yeah, well, if we do the maths, it just doesn't work out. All we have, they say, they just repeat the same thing. All we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. Like, they didn't even mention the 5 loaves up front because it didn't actually matter. This is one guy's lunch. All we have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus said, well, just get everybody seated. One of the other stories in Mark says he gets the disciples to arrange them into hundreds and fifties. Now imagine being that guy. Guys, hello, can I have your attention? Yeah, we're just going to form groups of 100. About 15,000 of us. There'll be quite a few groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You guys, can you just sit over here? And then one of the guys says, why are we doing this? That's a great question. Jesus just said, could we have groups of hundreds or between 50 and 100? Kids, I mean, crying, food, just, can you hear me? 50s, hundreds, yeah, thank you. Jesus said 50s, hundreds. What's coming next? I don't know. I can hear guys talking. What? Apparently they've only got 5 loaves and 2 fish. Well, this should be interesting. But interestingly, everybody's still there, these thousands of people. Maybe they just going to hang around, never know what's going to happen with Jesus. And here's the thing. It challenges me that Jesus provides a problem for the problem instead of a solution up front. Because actually Jesus had created the entire problem. Who kept the crowds there all day, healing and teaching them? It was Jesus. Who instructed them not to be sent away? Once again, Jesus. Who gave the disciples an impossible task? Jesus. There's one thing, so Jesus has all the answers, but in this case, he provides a problem. He provides a problem for the problem to give an even better solution. And so often, we bring our problems to him, and we say, well, you didn't give me the answer in the way I wanted it. That problem just seemed to generate another problem. And when that happens, there can be or should be some excitement in my heart if I read this or understand the story, because when Jesus creates a problem to answer the problem, it's because he's looking for a bigger solution. He, in other words, is more interested in his disciples' character than in their comfort. He's more interested in growing their faith than in their maths being correct. And he says, don't worry, you organize them in crowds, just 50s, 100s, and bring the food to me. And what an incredible thing to be there watching, just like now it's gone way past me as a disciple. Like I'm in way over my head here, organized the 50s and 100s. And we got the 5 loaves and 2 fish, but now it's just in territory that is unknown to me, but was always known to Jesus. He could have at any point just produced bread and fish. Early on, before they got hungry. He could have done anything at any point, and yet he chose to let the problem grow to help his disciples' faith grow. We had a very eccentric science teacher who did grade 10, 11, and 12. That's standard 8, 9, and 10 for those who were in that era. Did science with us. Beginning of grade 10, first lesson, he says, guys, I'm going to be with you to the end of matric. With his broad Scots accent, very eccentric man. and he was adamant that he was going to get the highest marks out of our class possible. And so what he did is that for year 1 and year 2, he crammed some of the matric syllabus and a little bit in grade 11, and by about May in my matric year, we'd done our entire syllabus. And then the next lesson, he arrived with 2 booklets, 14 years worth of past matric exam papers for paper 1 and 14 years for paper 2. And he hands it out to everybody. There was not a whole lot of joy in that class that day. He said, I told you in grade 10, I'm going to get the maximum marks out of you. And the way we're going to do it is I've given you 14 years worth of problems to solve. And every night we were given a number of problems to go through, and every day he would go through the solutions. We hated him for it at the time. All the other kind teachers had just allowed our syllabus to stretch out over the right amount of time. But Mr. Miller, he wasn't that kind of teacher. He was the unreasonable kind who wanted that kind of result. And so we did 14 years worth of paper 1, 14 years worth of paper 2. By the time we sat down at our final exam, guess what? Most of what was in the exam, we'd already seen every variation of it because we'd done 14 years worth of problems. That exam paper was not set by our Mr. Miller. It was set by external examiners. But Mr. Miller knew the way to prepare these guys for that exam is to give them problem after problem after problem, not just the answers. And Jesus in the same way drops problem after problem to his disciples and in our lives. He says, I'm preparing you for a bigger exam than just tonight's supper. Your faith needs to grow. You walk with me 14 years, you'll have 14 years worth of problems. I'm putting those in inverted commas because to him, there's no problem. But in my little world, it's the Rubik's Cube, trying to figure it out. And then the disciples' faith, imagine seeing now Jesus say, okay, guys, thank you, all the groups, we're going to say grace. Gives thanks. Breaks the bread and then puts it in the hands of the disciples. Imagine being Matthew, for example, the writer of the story. And you walk around and you're like, well, here goes. And you give out the first chunk, bang, and it just grows back. I don't know how it went, but do you want some more? And then you go to the next guy, and by the time you get to person number 30, you're like, yahoo, this is fantastic! Bread for everybody. You want some more fish? Don't worry, Thomas has got that. He'll be through in a minute. The miracle is happening in their hands. How do you think their faith responded? What do you think happened the next time they ran short of food? You might have expected them to say, well, you know what, Jesus has got this. Just sit in groups. Anybody got any loaves and fish? Can I tell you what happened the next time they ran short of food? The exact same story outplayed. Matthew 15. It says, so they go to Jesus, say, we don't have enough food. He says, well, what have you got? They say, we've got 7 loaves and a few fish. Send the people away. No, let them stay here. The exact same thing happens. The bread and fish multiply. They pick up 7 baskets full of leftovers. You might have thought by that point they got the point. Matthew 16. They go on a boat trip on the Sea of Galilee and they've forgotten bread. They're traveling unprepared. And Jesus says this to them, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees, meaning, watch out for hypocritical religion that has got a form of godliness but denies its power. That's what it means to be aware of the yeast. Do you know what they say to each other? It's because we didn't bring enough bread. That's why he's telling us to be careful of the yeast, because he knows we don't have enough bread. Do you know what Jesus says to them? Guys, when we fed I'm putting my tone onto it. He might have said it much more compassionately, but just... He says, guys, when we fed the 5,000, how many basketfuls of leftovers did you pick up? They say 12. He says, and when we fed the 4,000, how many basketfuls of leftovers did you pick up? You read it, Matthew 16. They say 7. This is Jesus' full theological answer to them. Do you still not understand? And that also challenges me, because God's miracles of provision in my past should be enough for me to walk into the next problem and say, you know what? This has got slightly different equation, But I know God provides the solutions in time. It always looks a bit different. But instead, the next little problem hits my world, the next little bit of storm and shakes the boat, and I'm like, oh, God. He's like, wait, when we went through that together, how did you come through? I said, my faith was stronger. And then you went through the next thing, and what happened? I said, my faith was stronger. And the next thing, and the next thing. I can imagine Jesus with me sometimes saying, do you still not understand, Steve? Seriously? The beautiful thing about Jesus is that because of his compassion, as I said earlier, he doesn't just, okay, 3 times, 3 strikes, no more bread ever for you guys. In fact, he says to them, for the rest of your lives, for the rest of the church's history, every time you eat bread, remember me. He taught his disciples how to pray. He said, every time you pray, you can pray like this, give us this day our daily bread. I care for you enough that every day I want to provide what you need for that day. If you're married, you do not have what it takes to be the spouse that your spouse deserves. If you're a parent, you do not have what it takes. I do not have what it takes to be the parent that my children deserve. If you're a son or a daughter, you don't have what it takes to be the kind of child your parents should have if you're following Christ. If you're an employer, you don't have what it takes to be the right employer that your employees deserve. And if you're an employee, you don't have what it takes to be what your employer deserves. Every level of our involvement with other people, we don't have what it takes. We've got the 5 loaves and the 2 fish in a world that needs 10,000 meals. And the beauty of the story is that I can go third position, put myself in the position of the boy with what I've got, and I can say, God, I don't have what it takes to be the husband or wife, the parent, the child, the employer, the employee, the entrepreneur that I need to be. Please help. And there's a beautiful picture in how Jesus prayed that his disciples observe. It says he took what they had, the loaves and the fish, and he looked up, he looked heavenward, and gave thanks and then distributed it. And my whole life, this should be a picture that I get to follow. The little bit that I've got that's not enough, come before God, I can look heavenward, I look vertically, and I say, God, thank you. I don't have enough, but I'm thanking you for what I have. Please multiply it out into the world. The vertical precedes the horizontal. The vertical empowers the horizontal. We spoke about it at the beginning of this year. Here's another example of Jesus' relationship with his Father empowers the horizontal. I get to do the same. The third thing I'd like you to notice from this is that Jesus Christ satisfies all hunger. This is a bigger point than just physical bread. Matthew 14:20, they all ate and were satisfied. What's really interesting is that John records the story, but he adds in a little PS. It's John chapter 6. He says what happened after that is the next day Jesus went elsewhere and large crowds came again. And Jesus this time said to them, you guys are just following me because you ate your fill yesterday. You're following me only because of the bread and the food that I gave you. And then he says, look for the eternal food. It's a bit cryptic. And so they say, well, where should we go for that? And he engages in this conversation. And then it comes down in John chapter 6, verse 35, where Jesus then says to them, to this crowd that's gathered, he says, I am the bread of life. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. In other words, this miracle pointed to a bigger truth, is that you've got a physical hunger, that physical bread will just satisfy in little bits, but every human being has got a much bigger eternal hunger, spiritual hunger, and there's only one bread that can satisfy. And Jesus Christ made this astonishing claim. He says, I am the bread of life. It's an astonishing claim because in that time, barley and wheat were the chief crops that were grown. So the chief carbs anywhere in the world is what people eat most of the time. In that time, it's bread. If you go to China, the chief staple diet is rice. Maybe if Jesus had have been in China in flesh, he would have said, I'm the rice of life. In a lot of African countries, it's maize meal, putu or pap here, sadza if you're in Zimbabwe, and sima in Malawi, different names for the same thing. He might have said, I am the nsima of life. The basic ingredient to satisfying hunger. In Ethiopia, they make a thing called injera. It's made from a tiny little seed called teff. And it's the staple diet. It tastes really, really different to everything else. But injera is the thing in Ethiopia. Maybe there he would have said, I'm the injera of life. It was that earthy that I can satisfy the hunger of the human soul. It's a profound statement once again. I read a story of an Indian missionary, a man named, I got away from my lectern here, Sundar Singh, that many years ago was distributing gospels in the central provinces of India, and he came to some non-Christians on a railway train, and he gave a man a copy of John's gospel. The man took it and in anger tore it into pieces and threw it out of the window. That might have been the end of the story, were it not for a man seeking for the truth, who happened to be walking along the train line and picked up a tiny fragment of paper and read on it these words, I am the bread of life. It had no context, so he went and asked his friends, family, where does this come from, I'm the bread of life? They said it comes from the Christian's book. He went and read this text. Oh, in fact, his friend said to him, don't read that book or you will be defiled. The man thought for a moment and then said to his friends and family, I want to read the book that contains this beautiful phrase. And he bought a copy of the New Testament. He was shown where this sentence occurred, John chapter 6, I am the bread of life. And as he studied the gospel, the light flooded into his heart and he came to the knowledge of Jesus Christ. And he became a preacher of the gospel in the central provinces of India. That little bit of paper through God's Spirit was indeed the bread of life unto him, satisfying his deepest need. Jesus is saying more than just I'll provide your day-to-day needs. He says I'll provide your eternal hunger and thirst needs. There might be people here today that you have never realized that knock that you feel, that the gap you feel in your life is actually, the Bible refers to it as spiritual hunger. And you can throw as much pleasure into it, as many relationships, as much hedonism, doing as much as you want for yourself. You can throw as many good deeds into that as you want. You can throw going to church in there if you like. If you don't come to the bread of life, you stay spiritually hungry. And Jesus with a single statement, again, either lunatic, liar, or Lord. And the fact that he's just multiplied the bread definitely puts him in the Lord category. He says, I'm the bread of life. The deepest hunger of the soul I can satisfy. If you hear this morning and you're somebody who knows this phrase to be true, that Christ is the bread of life and he satisfied my hunger or your hunger, you're a Christ follower. You eat of Christ if you like. Give me this day my daily bread refers to more than just my daily needs. It refers to Christ himself. If that's us, then surely those of us who have come to the unlimited supply of eternal sustenance should be generous enough to let other people know. Somebody put it like this: being a Christian, talking about the gospel, is like one beggar telling another beggar where to find food. The bread of life, it's such an amazing, incredible, beautiful, and complex concept. Today we've got a team up in Mozambique speaking about the bread of life. We've got two guys in Australia at a training time being trained on how to be better at speaking about the bread of life. I was so chuffed to hear so much feedback during our detox series about each one reach one, where people took that to heart and said in our group, every person here, we're going to invite one more person into our group. I had some group leaders complaining to me saying, we've got a massive problem. Our groups aren't big enough for all the people that have been invited. Sorry, the houses aren't big enough. What a great problem to have. One beggar going to another beggar and saying, hey, we've got some food to talk about. We've got another amazing opportunity for us beggars to do the same thing, and that's the Alpha course. There's literal food, but far more important than that is spiritual food. I know of so many different people who through Alpha have either deepened their connection with God or come into a connection with God. Because as we start talking about the bread of life, and the Bible says, taste and see that the Lord is good. As you begin to taste and begin to see, you realize this isn't all that I thought it was. It's much more and much more difficult, much more satisfying and much more complicated, all of that. But this satisfies the hunger of the soul.